Okay, thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. Um, Today's webinar is Syria at the Crossroads, Regional Politics and the Movement for Palestine. And this is the second webinar that we've organized jointly with MERIP and Spectre Journal that's been focused on Syria after the overthrow, or since the overthrow of the Assad regime. My name is Shireen, and I'm on the editorial board of Spectre, and I'll be moderating the first half of this webinar, but before turning it over to Jim from MERIP. Our speakers today are Rama Kodemi, who's a Syrian American activist based in DC, a longtime BDS campaigner, and a former member of the National Committee of the War Resisters League. We also have Joseph Daher, a Swiss-Syrian academic and activist, and author of several books on Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. And finally, we have Yasmin Mobayed, who's a history PhD student at the University of Chicago. Yasmin previously worked as the managing editor of the Syria Report and as a translator for the local coordination committees and other Syrian grassroots organizations during the 2011 uprising. So today's webinar will focus more on regional politics and Syria's relationship to Palestine. Since our previous webinar, there have been major regional and geopolitical developments. Israel started a war with Iran that the US has now actively joined. And Israel has also continued to expand its incursions in Syria. In addition, the US, EU, and UK have suspended many of the sanctions on Syria. And whether Syria will normalize with Israel is an open question in the current moment. So my first question, which I'll address to Joseph, is on the question of sanctions. In mid-May, Trump announced he would drop sanctions on Syria, and he began the process of lifting them, and that was followed by the UK and EU. So how are sanctions affecting Syria, and what does lifting them allow for now? Does the suspension of sanctions mean that Trump was satisfied that Ahmed al-Shara is in the process of normalizing with Israel? So a big question, but I'll hand it off to you, Joseph.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you, James, and thanks to all the organizers. It's really a pleasure to be among such great people, and hopefully we can have a fruitful discussion. So regarding the sanctions, first of all, I think it's important to say that this has been welcomed very positively by a large section of the Syrian population. We've seen people going out in the streets to celebrate this because US sanctions especially have represented one of the major obstacles to witness a future economic recovery. Personally, I was very happy of this, despite the lack, I would say, of democratic guarantees that this government can provide. And this was never the issue about democratic issues, even under the Assad regime. And what is important to say is that I've always been very critical of the sectoral sanctions, even prior to the fall of the Assad regime, because it was impoverishing and hitting very hard the economy. For example, the productive sectors of the economy, to the ability to import, it was isolating the financial system, and also affecting key areas of human human capacities, health system, education system, basically the whole of the economy, but also impoverishing same population. The sanctions contributed to this. It wasn't the only reason. It's important also to remind that the main reason for the impoverishment of the same population, destruction of infrastructures, was the Assad regime. It was their policies that was causing the fact that 90% of the population was living under the poverty line. So definitely, for me, this was a good news. And although the process has to continue, because while sanction and lifting progressively the sanction, it's not complete. We have to be clear also. It has to follow the process, which is still ongoing. And this instability also creates a number of problems. It's not a surprise that in the hours following the announcement of the relief sanctions, and not the end of the sanctions, we had the announcement in the days after of several foreign direct investment memorandum of understanding with various regional international companies. But if we look at the majority of these companies, they're generally backed by a particular country. So CGM is really the French state. You had the Dubai World, basically the Emirate ruling actor, and the Qatari-led consortium, which is backed by Qatar and is part of the family. We come back maybe later on of the Hamsho family, even though they have disagreement, which was a big businessman within Syria. But this is also to say that the process is not complete. So it doesn't give a full green light to investors to go back, whether for the Syrian diaspora, foreign businesses. So this process has to be completed. Secondly, we still have very much structural challenges. We should be clear. Removal of sanctions are good news, but doesn't mean that you have economic recovery tomorrow. And especially with the current economic policies of the government led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. But we have, high cost of production that have been increasing, lack of or shortages of key energy resources, lack of electricity, key infrastructures have been destroyed. Skilled workers are still outside of the country or are still leaving the country, large-scale migration, low salaries, even though the fact that today the government increased by 200% is still not enough. We're reaching a minimum salary of $80 to $100. A family of 5 in Damascus needs at least $600. So it's not at all enough. The Syrian pound is still not stabilized, and we have competition from other currencies, Syrian pound, Turkish pound. So we still have many structural challenges. And the fact that the government is liberalizing and privatizing the economy this way is also creating, I think, new and deepened challenges, and not being a rupture with the former regime, but more of a continuation, especially when it comes to austerity measures, bread, in the future electricity, but also agriculture. We're witnessing a severe drought in Syria, one of the most serious drought in the past decades, and the government is talking about potentially removing subsidies to the agriculture sector. So I'll stop here maybe because I already spoke a lot, and let the second part of the question, if I may, just one single word on this. I think it's not only about normalization with Israel, but more about rooting Syria in a new kind of US-led alliance with Turkey and Gulf monarchies. And obviously the lifting of sanctions came into conditions. I'm happy to go back to this question later on. Thank you, Shirin.
Okay, yeah. I guess another part of that question is, well, building on the question of normalization, there was a piece recently in Al Jamhuriya where the writer Dalia Ismail wrote that steps towards normalization with Israel come from Syria's weakness in the post-Assad period and not from a pro-Israel ideology within Syria. So I'm wondering if you all think this makes sense as a starting point to understand the transitional government's apparent efforts to meet with and perhaps normalize with Israel. And do you expect al-Shara to face backlash from the Syrian population if he does move forward with normalization or something similar? And I'll post the link to the article as well in the chat. But can I direct that to Rama and then Yasmin?
Yeah, thank you all for hosting us today for this conversation in the midst of a lot happening across the region. Yeah, the question of normalization is one that I think gets discussed a lot, especially for those of us who are in various movements. And I think I want to start with part of the problem we're dealing with is just there's been a lack of transparency from the government itself in this moment, where a lot of the analysis that I see coming out is based on, say, whatever U.S. congressman went and visited, come back and said, this is what I talked with al-Shara about, or whatever bots on socials is pushing, whether they're Iranian-backed bots, Israeli-backed bots, Gulf-backed bots that have obviously their own agendas. So I think one thing, and just to caution as we're having this conversation on normalization, is that ideas like part of the problem is we don't actually know what these conversations are. And there is no transparency, which is a big problem in this moment of time of just like, what does it mean for the government to be having these conversations, to be showing up in these meetings with these Gulf states, and making these deals? And then how does that get translated back? We see the people, excited. So when they're lifting of sanctions, we saw the people come out in the streets and celebrate. So there is a way to measure that. But that's not also necessarily happening when we're seeing these conversations about normalization either. Like it's not like people are like coming out and saying, yeah, this is the time to normalize. So I think that's a sense to get a sense of like where the people are at on these types of conversations. Another thing I like to point is, I try to think about like, I'm like, okay, yeah, a lot of critique and what is the alternative in this moment for this government to do in this time? That's not an excuse for what they may or not be doing, but it seems like the pathway that's being followed is this idea of just like opening up channels with a lot of different actors. Um, and and so whether or not that's showcasing that this is what an opening to also Israel is actually rooted in any sort of true motivation for normalization or true dedication to like this is what needs to happen for the future of Syria and this is what the Syrian people want, or it's part of what the officials are doing because they are being advised to do by, again, the US and the Gulf, or they're trying to protect as much as they can their ability to make decisions in the future by saying, yes, we're open to this, but not actually seriously going after, I think is a question. I do think it is interesting that the sanctions were said to be lifted and are being actively lifted without any actual normalization happening. And I think that is a significant point. That there is no there again, there might be something in the background that is guaranteed, but there's no official normalization that has happened that is contingent on the sanctions. The sanctions are being lifted. And so I think that's part of the thing to think about too, as well as it's like what will happen. I always tell people I trust in the people. The people are the people who got us to here. It's messy. It's going to continue to be messy. But I do think there is, the reality is Israel continues to occupy Syrian land, which is a point that has been brought up when officials have been asked directly. That is something that is coming up from different government officials of just like, well, we're different than say the countries that signed the Abraham Accords because they don't have land occupied. So I think there's that point that's being made as well. And again, I think it's just hard to decide exactly what's the direction is happening with the government itself because there's just that lack of transparency and the need to do that in all the factors that in all the affairs that they're dealing with right now.
Um, Dalia Ismail's piece, I feel like got a lot of flack from a lot of people. But I think she touches on something that is a kind of a reality of the situation, which is Israel, after the fall of the Assad regime, destroyed 80% of Syria's military capabilities. And this is a country in which, as Joseph mentioned, had been decimated by sanctions, by the Assad's own destruction of his own infrastructure. And it's a weak state, as many states in the Middle East, unfortunately, are, with the existence of this rogue nuclear state right next door. So I think there is her point that, immediately after the downfall of the regime, Israel neutralized whatever threat could materialize, I think is the correct. I agree with that point, and I agree with that argument. I think Rama brings up a good point, which is like we're all speculating what this normalization may be because we see that there's signaling here and there, but there's nothing totally confirmed. And I think the new government has kind of maintained an ambivalence, not quite, but an ambiguity in terms of what it's planning to do. And there is no transparency as well. And I think the most explicit statement that was made was that let's re-adhere to the 1974 agreement. But Netanyahu, in violating that agreement, actually said that agreement collapsed until order is restored. And so I guess my next point is that rather than speculating whether or not normalization will happen, which I think it will not happen without serious popular mobilization against the state. I mean, that would be a crisis of legitimacy at the popular level and also at the level of his own party. But this type of immediate assault of Syria after the fall of the regime, I think kind of shows what role the regime played for Israel. I'm remembering an interview in the Times by Rami Makhlouf, who was speaking to Anthony Shahid, and he says explicitly, there is no stability in Israel unless there's stability in Syria. And I think the fact that the turning point for one of the turning points during the Syrian conflict was the chemical weapons agreement, which was supposedly a red line, but then became something that kind of rehabilitated the regime because they agreed to the agreement. Later we find out 2 years later that the Minister of Intelligence of Israel at the time, Yuval Steinitz, came up with the plan, drew it up, and him and Netanyahu brought it to Russia and the US, and later explicitly said that this was not to be disclosed because then it would be made out into an Israeli conspiracy. But they were conspiring, and they entrenched the regime in rehabilitating it by, creating this chemical weapons deal, and then you're off. And then the next time we hear about Syria is about ISIS and the fight against the war against terror. So I think the fall of the regime and the immediate Israeli assault, bracketing whether normalization happens, which again, not without resistance from the people, I think it really actually reveals retrospectively the kind of position, the kind of relationship that is often kind of concealed within anti-imperialist rhetoric that the Syrian regime actually served for Israel.
Absolutely. Before I let you jump in, Joseph, I do think it's important to mention that there is a widespread idea on the left in the Palestine solidarity movement, at least in the US, and I know elsewhere, that the new government or the transitional government in Syria is bending over backwards for Israel while Assad was providing channels for the axis of resistance and their weapons, which obviously is simplistic at best. But yeah, Joseph, do you want to?
Yeah, I think there's two main points on what you just said. I think the best proof to this, how this rhetoric is wrong, how the Assad regime was, pro-Palestinian. There's many, we can go back from the 70s, but the best proof is that the day of the fall of the regime, Israel destroyed 80% of military infrastructures and expanded its occupation. Why? Because it knew that the previous regime would have never attacked it or was defending the border with Israel, actually. And this is, I think, a very important argument to make. Israel did not feel the need to do it before because Assad regime was protecting its borders and, preventing any kind of resistance from Syrian territories against Palestine occupied lands. So this is for me quite clear. The second thing is that Israel was very much from the beginning on basically US orders, very aggressive to expand its occupation, and it's still, destroying villages in the southern Syria, agricultural lands, etc., to bring in concessions from the new kind of ruling elite in Syria. And this is partially working. This is partially working in not only in the rhetoric. And this is my second point. I think we have to be very clear, is that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the leading actor today in Syria, the first and major objective of this actor is to stay in power. The first way to do this has been international recognition, not seeking recognition from the Syrian population, but international recognition. And this goes through recognition from the USA, but also guaranteeing its interests. How does it do this? Certainly, there's only, for the moment, indirect and direct talks in Azerbaijan, with Israeli officials, with Syrian officials, but there have been, things done on the ground, arresting particular Palestinian actors from Islamic Jihad. If you want to put aside, the Popular Front Commandement General, that was basically a proxy of Syria, definitely. But you also had a Palestinian member of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham that was very vocal about Palestine and from Gaza that was arrested as well from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So there's also signs. Similarly, they reinforced border control when it came to the transfer of weapons from Syria to Lebanon to Hezbollah, etc. This is not only for internal consumption. And I think here we have to understand, and where I agree on the article, it's not out of a pro-Israeli ideology, not at all. but it's about maintaining and consolidating the rule of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And this is how I think we have to see this kind of political orientation, including with Israel, to guarantee its interest, to satisfy and to root Syria in this new kind of US-led alliance in the region. And in this perspective, it is very pragmatic. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has a program now throughout the years, and it also in the perspective of its own political economic orientation, to welcome foreign direct investment from Gulf monarchies, from Turkey, and partially, potentially, from the US as well. And in some ways, we're living in a moment, and this is where I think we shouldn't separate from the foreign policy from the political economy. It's completely connected. We're living to some extent a moment when you see the Sadat moment in Egypt, when he starts the infitah policy. It was already the case in Syria, the neoliberal economy with Assad regime. But we have a deepening right now, seeking foreign capital, again, from these countries. And this translates into foreign policies. And we've seen this with Sadat. And there's a kind of rhetoric among section Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and people supportive to them. We have to do this form of normalization in order to witness a form of economic recovery and foreign direct investment. But actually, if we look at Egypt, it's quite the opposite. Despite US assistance of $1 billion nearly for the past 3 decades, we've seen increased impoverishment and increased wider social inequalities. And I think there's a path a bit similar in this way in Syria. And this is why it's not only out of hostility to Iran that I think Damascus is nearly the only capital that had not condemned US and Israeli attacks against Iran, but it's also, again, to root the country in these new islands. And really, I think we have to see this connected, the kind of foreign policy with the political economy. So it's definitely not out of pro-Israeli ideology. It's out of the necessity to consolidate the new kind of ruling actor in Syria by seeking international recognition.
Yeah, to tie it back a little bit to the sanctions, I do think I think, as we've mentioned, at first Trump said you'll have to normalize with Israel, and then it seems like, well, obviously they started the US, EU, UK started lifting many of the sanctions, but there's still that pressure and strings along the way. So I think the Caesar sanctions, it's like on a 6-month basis, they reevaluate. So there's still that kind of pressure to align with US demands. But then I guess I hope we talk more about popular from below dynamics, because there have been a lot of protests throughout Syria, or especially in parts where Israel is bombing and killing people. There have been protests, I think burning of Israeli aid sent in a manipulative way, obviously, on Israel's part. But Joseph, you mentioned going back to the 70s, and we did think it would be helpful to sort of root it back a little bit historically in the relationship between Syria and Palestine, especially obviously since the start of Israel's settler colonial project. So obviously in the past almost 2 years, the Palestine Solidarity movement has grown in really important ways, but there's still a lot of confusion about Syria. So it's a broad question, but what should people in the Palestine Solidarity movement know or understand about Syria and this historic relationship? Could I start with Rama and then Yasmin again?
Yeah, and you alluded to this earlier, Shireen, of just like a lot of the disinformation, propaganda, misinformation that has frankly impacted the ability to really build, you know, a movement that really takes on the entire region. I think specifically in the United States, we seem to deal with this as like a country by country basis when we know like a regional analysis and a regional and figuring out what that means then for our organizing is very important. And that's somewhat based on the fact that that's how Congress acts. Like they just act like country by country. And so folks like get pulled into that analysis versus again thinking about what are we building in terms of the alternative, and being like, I've worked a lot in Palestine movement spaces, and frankly being told at times like, well, what does Syria have to do with any of this, like over the years, and very frustratingly having to push back on this idea of like, what do you mean, what does Syria have to do all this? So it's like the obvious things like, well, our land is also occupied by Israel since 1967. The rate of ethnic cleansing that happens actually in the Golan after the occupation was higher than the rate of ethnic cleansing that happened in 1948, if you're just thinking about percentages and folks like, so like it's a huge, big deal. And part of it is the history that people want to highlight usually is like, well, Assad's been at the forefront of the struggle for Syria, and that is why Assad couldn't fall, and that's why there was this whole conspiracy to bring down his regime, etc., and etc. And that's something that, yes, of course, there was a role for the regime to play that allowed weapons to flow to various Palestinian factions. We're not going to deny that. But also the reality is this regime clamped down on a lot of Palestinian activism, whether they committed their own massacres or jailed their own Palestinians. There were Palestinian folks being released from prison, freed from prison when the regime fell back in December. And that's a reality that people wanted to ignore and not deal with. And the reality of we've now, when the regime fell 6 months ago, we had been, a year plus into a genocide that Assad did nothing about. He was using his planes to bomb Idlib that entire time, versus doing anything for Gaza. And so, to me, the biggest thing that I want to stress for folks in Palestine work is that there is the worry now that folks have for, well, what does Syria now mean for Palestine? And like, this is now the end of the cause and all of that stuff. I frankly am not interested in that worry from the folks who were not supportive of the Syrian people throughout throughout the revolution, that were whitewashing Assad's crime. Like, the Syrian people will figure it out. Don't worry. Your worry is not our concern, like, is not going to benefit us. So I think that's one thing to stress. And again, why are we falling, say, for example, into the disinformation and propaganda that's, say, coming from the US or the Gulf or Iran? I think it happens again and again. It's just like, well, we saw this random like these random statements from government officials that say, there's normalization happening definitely, and etc. Like, be more on top of your analysis into these types of things. There's a lot that can happen. I'm not saying normalizing it will or not, but there's a lot that can happen. And yes, the government that came to power in Syria at this moment is not some leftist, anti-imperial power, etc., socialist government, etc. That's the reality. And also it is the people of Syria who helped bring this about too. So I think that's the balance that we have to stick with, and really asking people to like take a moment. Palestine is leads for a lot of us one of the most important part of regional politics, and also it is not the only thing that is happening. And I think that's where we kind of get of just like we just erase everything else in the struggles and want to focus in on one part of the struggle, but that's not our histories. It's not the history of the region. It's not the history of our people. Just take the case of Mahmoud Khalil, for example. You have who's been, alhamdulillah, just got released and reunited with his wife and his son. I mean, this is a Palestinian refugee born and raised in Syria. That's just the reality of his story. And his story is something that people will be like, oh, actually, he's problematic politically if they really want to dig in based on like what. But that's the reality of the region we're living in. And how do we make these connections? And the last thing I'll end in, because I see a couple of these questions around like, what is the Syria's leadership now position on Palestine? What are they going to do right now? I wish there was one power in the region that is truly willing to go in and do what needs to be done now to stop the genocide in Gaza. Let's just be real. They either don't have the power or the political will. And I think sometimes we also focus in so much on the region and forget that there's the other players across the globe that are also not stepping up into their role. So think about Brazil, for example. Why are oil workers right now in Brazil begging Lula to stop sending oil to Israel? Lula called this a genocide months and months ago. Why is the oil still flowing? Why is China? I'm not a fan of China, but in this moment, we have to, like, there's something needs to happen. China is Israel's second largest trading partner. Why has there not been sanctions? So I do think there is a reality too of just like where our focus is on, like why aren't these actors doing XYZ? And sometimes we're putting the attention on the wrong actors.
Um, I think there are many ways to kind of tell the history of the relationship between Syria and Palestine. So in one sense, if we wanted to tell a popular history, we can see that, Syrians and Palestinians and Lebanese, those in the Levant, are tied through family, through lineage, through language, through culture, through a common cause, and really separated by a border that was drawn in the last century. There is no liberation in Syria unless there is a liberation in Palestine, and this in this moment when we're seeing Israel within the past, year and a half invading all of the countries in the Levant, and then now attacking Iran. I mean, this tells you that this is a state that is rogue and that will not stop merely at the genocide in Palestine. One kind of slogan that I really, really love is that the borders are dirt and the cause is one. And actually, the namesake of the Qassam brigades of Hamas is a Syrian from Jableh. He was an anti-colonial, anti-Zionist revolutionary whose assassination actually was one of the contributing factors of the 1936 Arab revolt in Palestine. And so this history goes back far for many Syrians. Under Hafez and Bashar al-Assad, Palestine was actually the channel through, and for many of us, that Palestine was actually the channel through which politics was practiced, and also a channel through which the anxiety of the regime around Palestine mobilizing its people also appeared, because it was a channel through which, a critique of the Zionist entity could also lead to chants against the Syrian regime. But that aside, and Rama also rightly points out that, Palestinians in Syria are the sons and daughters of the Syrian uprising and sacrificed so much. And actually, PYM was founded by a Syrian Palestinian as well, who was born in one of the refugee camps in Syria. But that aside, the kind of, if we wanted to look at the kind of the scum underneath the very outdated ahistorical representation of the regime as somehow being ideologically pure on the Palestinian cause, this is also very clear if we look at the historical relationship between not only Syria, but authoritarian regimes and Arab regimes in general, in the way that they kind of exploited and undermined the Palestinian nationalist resistance movements. Syria contributed to factionalism. Joseph raised it, but the PFL-PGC was a splinter from the PFLP, and yet carried nothing out against Israel. Fatah Intifada, a split from Fatah, because of the very fraught relationship that Bashar al-Assad had with Yasser Arafat. And so not just factionalism and also like the sowing of intra-Palestinian rivalries as well at the hands of this regime. But the regime also had a non-confrontation, a policy of non-confrontation as well with Israel. The Golan has been occupied since 1967. It went into Israeli law in 1981. In 2011, Syrians and Palestinians were protesting near walking towards the Golan border and were shot at by the IOF. And Syria did nothing to protect its children and to as the patriarch of the Palestinian cause in the Levant did nothing. More than that, also, I think is important that these authoritarian regimes also arrested many Palestinian leaders, among them George Habash for 10 months, among them Yasser Arafat as well, among them Palestinian Marxist Salam Akile, too, actually twice, once under Hafez al-Assad and the other under Bashar al-Assad. What does that do to a movement when you're arresting its leaders? not to go too far in, but like, I think it's also noteworthy that it's not just kind of indirect or seemingly indirect violence. Syria participated in the Tel Zatar massacre in 1976, and this was greenlit by the US, greenlit by Israel, and it backed right-wing Christian militias to massacre 1,500 Palestinians. And this was not because, I mean, this was in a way the Syrian regime's kind of geopolitical wager. It was against the PLO. It wanted to consolidate its hegemony in Lebanon, and so it was backing. And if you look later on, you see it switches sides pragmatically. But because it has its own interests in mind. And actually in 1976, after the Riyadh summit, the Times published an article that says Syrians win, Palestinians lose. And that's because the Palestinian factions were expelled. And not even a decade later, Syria again backs militias to fight the PLO and the PFLP because at that point they returned to Lebanon. And so all of these things at once kind of, I think, are necessary to understanding the historical relationship between Syria and Palestine. But if we wanted to go into the 2011 movement, you see the same tactics. The besiegement during the war of the camps were besieged, destroyed, food and medicine not brought in, starvation was extreme. And you see Bashar al-Assad use the same collective punishment against Yarmouk and other camps in Syria too. And Yarmouk, I mean, Yarmouk is, I think, like 60-70% destroyed, and it is the capital of the Palestinian diaspora, is what it's known as. Hundreds starved, shelling, destroying homes, hospitals, field hospitals. And this is besides the fact that, you know, the regime, because as Rama mentioned, like Palestinians were also sons and daughters of the Syrian uprising. You see Palestinians killed during the uprising, but also tortured to death. So 4,000 killed during the Syrian uprising, during the Syrian conflict, 600 tortured, including in the Palestine branch 235, which is notorious for its most sadistic torture schemes and tactics, that actually was formed in late 1960s, I think 1969, to monitor Palestinian groups in Syria, because they were a threat to the authority of the political authority of the Syrian regime. And so it's just, you look at the violence that Syrians and Palestinians and Kurds have experienced in Syria, the firepower, the airstrikes, the starvation tactics, all of these tactics used against the people, and nothing towards Israel. Sorry, I'll stop soon. But just one last thing is I think as leftists, there is a real reckoning that we need to do, because you have we should be heirs to the critical thinking of Hassan Kanafani, who criticized the petty bourgeois military regimes. We should be heirs to George Habash, who said in a very passionate speech in Beirut that Hafiz killed more Fatah members and members of the Rejectionist Front, which was a coalition that rejected the two-state solution, more than he killed Zionists in clashes with Israel. Shame on the Syrian clientele regime. And it's true. And yet we somehow have completely lost sight of that among the left. And I really think it's because the reckoning needs to come, because we're in a post-Cold War world. And actually we need to stop looking at these states, the axis of resistance. It's obviously terrifying to think that it's done for, because it's still a deterrence, of course. But at the same time, we need to realize that actually we need to be creative. Israel is now rising as the new hegemon with no deterrent force, not in Lebanon, not in Iran, and certainly not in the normalization in Syria. So yeah, I'll stop there.
I think Joseph wanted to add a point to this.
No, I think that the point has been made regarding.
Okay.
No, I mean, the point has been made regarding the Syrian regime's history. We could even add more examples just to show how this regime was working against Palestinian interests and just the popular classes' interest in the region. But more generally speaking, really, I think what Yasmin ended is that we have to focus, and including the Palestine Solidarity Movement, include Palestine within a regional and international perspective. And this is key if we want to foresee a liberation and emancipation of the Palestinian people one day. One of the latest indicators of this is the behavior of Egypt regarding the Gaza market, stopping them, sending thugs, and just show you, this is a reflection, more generally speaking, of the behavior of regional ruling regimes, that we should not count on this kind of regime to expect Palestinian liberation. And this goes, not only about Arab authoritarian regime, but also Iran and Turkey. I think we have to be very clear as well that they're playing a very negative role, and except rhetoric, has done nothing for the Palestinian liberation. On the opposite, regarding Turkey continuing, economic trade relation with Israel. And we spoke about the so-called axis of resistance that, also did since 7th October was quite, it's a complete failure. We can defend the right of resistance for Lebanese, Syrians, Palestinians, Iran, regardless of their leadership. But we have to be clear that the political orientation of the axis of resistance is a catastrophe, and that you cannot build resistance without a political project promoting democracy, social justice, and equality. And actually, the fact that Hezbollah is so unpopular in Lebanon and in Syria is because of its actions within Lebanon and within Syria. Similar for Iran. If it's so unpopular today in wide sectors of the region, it's because it played a form of regional imperialism in Iraq, in Syria, and in Lebanon. And it should ask us in this period, and coming back to Syria, it's a very contradictory movement, very dangerous. The fall of a regime opens a political space. You can speak much more freely of Palestine today. And when we saw the temporary so-called ceasefire in Gaza in January, you had thousands, tens of thousands of Syrians going in the streets to demonstrate this solidarity. This was impossible at the time of the Assad regime. At the same time, it's very dangerous because, as it was mentioned, since the 7th of October, there's a willingness of the US through Israel to impose hegemony through wars. And the latest example is Iran. And as I was explaining, the current ruling actors in Syria want to consolidate their power, and they see no alternative. This is why they're going into this, I believe, this direction, to consolidate their power. So it's a very contradictory moment. So I'll stop here. But I think the key message is for the Palestinian Solidarity Movement to root its cause in struggle from below. Otherwise, it makes exceptionalism of Palestine, and it's negative.
Yeah.
I believe so.
No, absolutely. I think all of you stressed really well that Syria and Palestine's liberation depend on each other, and any population under the fist of a dictatorship is not going to help the liberation of Palestine, and that we can't analyze the region state by state, but altogether. And then just the last thing I'll emphasize, at risk of being repetitive, the reactionary status quo that Ashara and the new government is joining into, where Jordan is profiting off of the aid drops into Gaza and shooting down missiles shot at Israel, and Egypt, as you mentioned, Joseph, is deporting people coming to march in solidarity with, or at Rafah. But I'll hand it over to James from Merip to moderate the last few questions.
Thank you, Shireen, and thank you so far, Joseph, Rama, Yasmin. I'm learning a lot from this, and I think this is exactly the kind of conversation that we hope to have here. I want to kind of pick up where Yasmin left off and bring things out of the historical mode, as much as I love that, back to today, because I think one of the core kind of problematics or contradictions we've been trying to get at in these conversations is to understand the kind of what exactly is the disjuncture between elite level leadership in Syria and popular movements. So how do we understand the clear disjunctures in Syria between popular feeling towards Israel and the regime's attitude, and we've touched on that already. But even maybe stretching it more broadly, I mean, there's, I think, a disjuncture between local Kurdish groups and the PKK leadership in Turkey and Iraq. We're seeing this iteratively across all of the communities and popular movements of which all of Syria's people are a part. So, how are popular movements making a critique of al-Shara, and how are they building both the internal solidarity and outreach to popular movements across the region that we've already said is so necessary and important in this moment? I want to give Yasmin a chance to pick up on that, but then Rama and Joseph, please feel free to chime in.
I mean, since Israel has been bombing Syria, invading further into southern Syria, there have been protests, widespread protests, and I haven't gone back to Syria yet, but I'm not sure if Rama has, but Joseph can, I'm sure, raise the discussions that are actually happening on the ground. But one anecdote that I find quite interesting that was reported by the Syria report is on so Israel, as many of us know, has invaded further into southern Syria, into towns of Quneitra and Daraa, and it has, confiscated agricultural land, which is a livelihood of southern Syrian farmers. It's taken over water sources, many of which are the main water sources for towns and villages. It's taken over military posts that were abandoned by the Syrian army, as well as constructing new military outposts as well. And of course, it's shelled, it's killed, it's raided, it's interrogated, and it's detained Syrians too. So the anecdote is kind of seeing how on the ground a popular mobilization that's not channeled through the form of protest, but also not channeled through maybe official entities or institutions, whether related directly to the transitional government or not, I think is important to know. So in March, the IOF seized a military post near two towns, Mariye and Kouaya, and it was attempting to build an outpost nearby. And so it called through drone loudspeakers, which of course we've seen terrorize farmers of shepherds of the West Bank as well. Through drone loudspeakers, sent a message to local residents telling them to come negotiate. So residents ended up talking to the transitional government in Damascus and asked, what to do. But interestingly enough, the government did not, take up the negotiations itself. Instead, it told them to negotiate. And this opening, I think, is what's very interesting. So the residents ended up creating a delegation, like a local delegation, met with the Israelis, and the Israelis offered them medical supplies, food, fuel in exchange for non-confrontation. And the residents rejected that outright. And so then they ended up demanding that they hand over their weapons, their personal weapons, some not even used for, battle, some just for farming and hunting. And the locals refused again. And so what ended up happening is that led to clashes. And it was, I think, hours of clashing between the IOF and this group of local residents who are protecting their land. And in the end, there were Syrian martyrs, of course, and may they rest in peace. But I think there were 7 in total. But in the end, the IOF withdrew. And I think that seeing examples of things that don't quite fit into how Syria is usually discussed, seeing armed mobilization that's neither neither expressed through, the factions that we know since 2011 and the many new ones that have formed since then, and not through kind of a concession to the state negotiate on our behalf, I think kind of shows you what you need to see about the ethos of the Syrian people. And the other part of that's interesting for me is that there's like the fact that the Syrian transitional government told them, go negotiate on your own. We're not going to negotiate for you. Almost like, that is the state's role. And yet it gave room for maneuver, I suppose. Maybe because it does not want to ruin its signaling to the West. Maybe it's a pragmatic decision like that. Maybe because they see these local residents as non-threatening compared to, like, I don't know, PIJ or some other factions that they want to disarm. Is, we can think about that. But I think it's interesting that, like, in this moment, because the regime is also in a precarious place, there's rooms for different expressions of mobilization that don't get talked about enough. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's a fantastic example. I think of the kind of creativity you all were referencing just a little bit earlier, right? It's like, resistance that doesn't have necessarily the organization or I don't know, branding is the wrong word, but like, doesn't have the signaling that other forms of armed resistance have in the past, and that, can be an example perhaps in some sense. Rama, I wanted to give you a chance to answer that question if you wanted to. Go ahead.
I think I'll just highlight like another example, just brief. Like, I'm thinking about the people whose loved ones are still disappeared. And for a while early on, folks were upset because they're like, what happened to our family? We still don't know what happened to our family. Like, when the prisons were emptied and then some mass graves were found, but still, there's a lot of people unaccounted for. And for a while, the government was not meeting with these families, and people were really upset. Like, you're meeting with foreign dignitaries, you're meeting with family members of Western folks who were disappeared, but your own people you're not meeting with. And people started protesting in the streets, making demands, and they finally got a meeting. And they continue to be protesting and making demands. Like, I think that's been very powerful, seeing these family members, to continue to take their demands in this moment. Again, something that would have never happened under Assad regime. So I do think there is this, like, and these are regular people. They're not activists necessarily, but they're feeling their way of what does that mean in this moment that we have this ability to make these demands. And I think that's part of it too, is just like, my relatives in Syria who I talk to because I want to know what they're feeling about with everything that's happening, like they're not activists. They honestly never posted anything during the 14 years of revolution. We're very, careful about what they said on the phone, what they posted. And for them, there's still this, even I was calling this morning, talking to one of my aunts, because I was actually planning to go to Syria this week. I've decided to cancel my plans for the moment, because of everything happening. But like, she was telling me, she's like, people really, like, they really still have, despite everything, there's still some hope, and like, they really love a Sharia, which we can talk about next. Like, there is this, like, folks, and I think that's like part of the struggle of organizing, right? A lot of times there's the movements we're part of, and we're organized and we talk to each other really well, but we don't have this, we don't have the numbers to do what we want, specifically in the US, but all across the globe. So how are we thinking about, again, the people who are not already in our circles and what they need to hear? And I think that's, the struggle of any organizer in any sort of space, is just like really thinking about, like, we have our analysis and the language we use and everything we've gone to get to this point of this, like, movement we're part of. But there's so many more people we need to actually accomplish what we want. And I think that's like something like an interesting moment of time of just like, what are the lessons that we can be feeding each other across these borders in this time?
Joseph, did you want to chime in on that as well? Go ahead, please.
Yeah, please. I think to speak of popular movement is a bit strong, honestly speaking, except if we talk about, the southern areas under occupation by Israel. We've seen popular reaction, popular, willingness to combat the occupation. But to speak of popular movements, I think it's a bit strong. I would say there've been protest movement, there've been a lot of conferences, sit-in. So we have political dynamism. But if you want to speak of stronger popular movements or larger, we find it in two main areas, honestly speaking. In the Northeast, under the autonomous administration, that's witnessed strong protest movement regarding the temporary constitution in March, but also in Sweden. We witnessed there's a strong protest movement that is organized with students, professional associations that are doing things. And also outside of the government of Damascus, with ongoing negotiations, with a lot of diversity also, even external intervention, with attempts of Israel to instrumentalize the Jews community while they don't care at all about their living condition, etc. And I think there's a clear break between prior to the sectarian massacres that occurred in the coastal areas against Alawite civilians, a few hundred, between 800 to more, following an attack by former militias from the Syrian regime that killed over 200 security services personalities. And there's a clear break. And I explain myself. In January, February, for example, you had, and this is one of the only movement that was present throughout the country, it was the public state employees being kicked out from their work or suspended. We don't know until when, and it's still the case. So we're talking about most probably more than 100,000 people, okay? And this is also part of the kind of austerity measures brought in by the regime, but there's also a sectarian and gender aspect to it. Because in the former regime, you had forms of clientelism that is well known and that favored the families of the martyrs, so-called of the Syrian army. So favoring parts of the Alawite. But also we know that in the public sector, women have a higher labor participation. So it's also targeting, women. And here you had massive, to some extent, significant demonstrations, protests throughout Syria nearly, in governmental areas under Damascus control, even in Sweden. And attempts to organize alternative forms of workers' representation, because the main General Federation of Trade Union, and here we see continuity with the previous regime, new leadership affiliated with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham were nominated. Following the massacres in March, this was broken. Afterwards, you had the sectarian attacks against the Jews. And I think here, again, it's to link with the political economy, but these were not accidents. These attacks were not accidents. They were in preparation since January. And sectarianism, just as it was used by the previous regime, is used with the current one, but in different dynamics. And I find there's three main dynamics. First of all, to constitute a so-called homogeneous Sunni bloc based on a so-called Mazlumiyya Sunniya, so-called injustice towards the Sunni community as a whole. And this ignoring, socioeconomic differences, regional differences, gender issues, etc. It's trying to build this through this form of sectarianism. Secondly, these attacks serve political interest. First of all, to break the kind of political democratic space that was in creation. As I was saying, massive protests did not occur from the public state employees. Attempts to do sit-in in Damascus in memory of the massacres of the coastal areas were attacked by supporters of the new government. So it broke kind of this democratic dynamic. Finally, these sectarian attacks helps the new government led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to consolidate its power in areas that were not fully controlled by it, coastal areas and Jews majority inhabited areas. Sweden, but as well in Damascus. Two areas were attacked in Damascus that have largely significant Jews population. Sahnaya, that was under the control of, if you want, local militias affiliated with the Jews. This is completely under the control of the government. The second main area where you do find actually a lot of leftists, it's very diverse, it's called Jaramana. Jaramana was at 2011 a city. It's in Damascus countryside, but it's 10 minutes from Damascus. If you want, in 2011, it was a city of 180,000 to 100,000, majority Jews, Christian, and a bit of Iraqi refugees. It welcomed, during the past decade, nearly 1 million people. Now we have a city that is 1 million people from IDPs from Damascus. And it's very, very dynamic politically. A lot of letters group, a lot of conferences, and was defended by armed groups affiliated with Syria. The attacks on this was attempt to control the city. It was a failure, similarly in Sweden. So we have this three dynamics. So it partially broke a bit. We've seen a couple of sit-ins lastly regarding the decision of the government to, I don't know how to call it, to basically normalize Fadi Sakhr, who was a war criminal that was under the armed regime that became, now, sorry to use the word, halal, or it became accepted now by saying that he serves the civil peace, which is quite the opposite. Similarly, we have so they've been some small, and yesterday we've seen also, it's important to note, several sit-in following the terrorist attack against the church in Damascus, in Homs for national unity. So again, to resume, popular movement's a bit strong. We have political dynamics, but it's also with different dynamics. And if we come back to the Northeast, it is more and more united despite many differences. The PYD, affiliated with PKK, and the more kind of Kurdish National Council, more affiliated with Barazani, but they had a unity conference. And here there's a clear battle with Damascus regarding decentralization, what kind of future. But they feel like, and I think understandable, they want to maintain what they have, but strategically speaking, I think to maintain some form of the institution they have to seek forms of collaboration with the wider left and democratic section of the Syrian people. Otherwise, I don't believe this can hold on a middle long term, especially with the rapprochement between Damascus, Hayy Tahrir Sham, and Turkish pressures.
Yeah, that I think is exactly right, and the Kurdish groups, especially getting themselves caught, I think a bit not just between Damascus and Ankara, but between or having to manage somehow the let's say dramatically changing relationships between Ankara and its internal Kurdish populations and PKK leaders there, the Dem Party, and so forth. It points up to me that it seems right to me that you're suggesting to recenter things on a broader leftist and Syrian movement in that environment. I wanted to circle back to how Rama started the answer to our last question, to talk for a minute about transitional justice. This was a huge topic of discussion in our first event in this series, and you brought up how the movements for transitional justice have been operating on a popular level. What can you tell us anything? Can you and I'd like to ask Yasmin the same question. Tell us, what is the prospect for a real reconciliation, or what is the status of pushing for a real reconciliation between the victims of Assad and the Syrian government led by Hayat Tahrir Sham?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would start with is just there needs to be, again, that back to that idea of like transparency that I mentioned earlier. Like it's both unclear what the future is, and then they're making moves like Joseph was mentioning, this Fadi Sakhr character, and like this idea of just like, oh well, we have to make decisions in order to move along and like deal with the economic situation. We might have to like not deal with the justice situation. And I think for me it's like very important because I think part of what happened, particularly I think, with the massacres that happened on the coast a few months ago, was folks, and I heard this from someone who had like was on the ground and was like sharing back of just like people were upset that so much attention was being made on these folks who were massacred then. They said it was wrong. And also they're like, but we were we were massacred too. Like we haven't seen any sort of justice in this last month. Like, why is all the attention now by the West and everyone else on, again, these quote unquote minorities, because that's what happens usually in terms of the Western analysis of the region, is like, we must protect the minorities. I mean, there were like ridiculous right-wing Christians were going crazy during that. I was just like, there's tens of thousands of Christians being massacred at the moment. That was like the rhetoric that was being shared by right-wing Christians in the US. It's like, this is not, it has nothing even to do with Christians. Like, you can't even choose the right minority to care about in this moment of time. So I think the continued lack of a clear process of just like, no, and taking seriously that there needs to be accountability for all the war crimes. And it's not only Assad, sadly. Again, we are dealing with a party that came to power. They're not the only ones making all the decisions. I think there's others also, but like the main party that came to power having its own history of crimes and needing accountability. And I think, to me, it's like, what is this space that for those of us who are not necessarily in Syria at the moment that can help, folks on the ground who want to create these spaces? Because I do think there needs to be a reckoning with that. And I don't mean like punishment or like people need to go to jail, but there needs to just be a space to really talk about it in ways that is not, so far, I think, have fallen short. Like I said, this idea of just like, well, we just need to, we need to give that, this idea of like, well, we need to give, certain minority communities something so that they can like accept the fact, that they're not in power anymore like they used to be, is just like, that's not the way to go. These like dealings and stuff. Like, how are we really building up this idea of Syria as a collective of all its people and all its communities, from whatever ethnic, religious, etc. background you are? And I think the other thing I'll add, it doesn't help, I think, when we, again, the folks on the outside giving the analysis also collapses everything into sectarianism. It's just like, oh, everyone just hates the Alawites because they're Alawis. And I'm like, it's more complicated than that. No to sectarianism, and also, if you're a remnant of a regime, that has to be part of the conversation as well. And I think that's where, like, it's, again, it's not an easy situation. It's not something that 6 months in we should have a solution to either. But I also think the government, of all the things I think the government maybe is falling short on, I think they need to be stepping into this more. And again, are they able to do it based on their own history or not, is a bigger question, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yasmin, did you want to speak to the transitional justice question as well?
I think, yeah, the points that Joseph and Rama brought up are important. I think, to Joseph's point, there is a sort of, I mean, HTS, the point that he raised is curious about kind of like this drive to kind of consolidate via homogenizing. But also at the same time, it's a very pragmatic political authority. The Fadi Sa'ad example, who reportedly was also involved in the attempted coup on the coast before the massacres, now, being incorporated as a negotiator, I think is a pragmatic decision on the part of HTS. To Rama's point, bringing up the massacres, I think, is a really important thing to note, because, I mean, I'm from Banyas, which is a coastal town in Syria, which saw massacres not only after the fall of the regimes of Alawites, but also in 2013 of Sunnis, who were massacred, not by bombing, but actually like door-to-door executions with knives and just really gory things. And my cousins would smell the scent of decaying flesh because they also were too afraid to get the bodies of the martyrs. During the 2011 conflict, Banyas, at the very beginning of the uprising, which it was the second city, I claim, Syrians will fight me on that, but the second city to rise up in protest, actually, one of the slogans was Alawite, Sunni, one hand. Banyas is predominantly Alawite. Sunnis are a minority, but in the city center, it is majority Sunni. and it was a beautiful kind of expression of the Syrian uprising's ideals. It's important to note that the ways that the regime also sowed sectarianism was not kind of, I don't know, like a faceless sectarianism of kind of bureaucratic, favoritism. Like in Banyas, the checkpoints were manned by people from villages that my family, for instance, knew, you know, people they grew up with, went to school with, like see at the grocery store. And they became kind of the oppressing force of the city that they both share and call home. And so now that we're in the post-Assad area moment, not dealing with like the deep fraught relationship and tensions and pain that Syrians, not only, you know, Syrians who were experienced violence under the hands of the regime, but also of, you know, Jabhat al-Nusra and minorities as well, that actually ended up believing the regime's rhetoric because they experienced that violence too. To be able to adequately deal with that means that there needs to be a kind of a truth and reconciliation committee that HTS is not doing. And it's not doing that because it has things to hide itself, and we know. So for me, any prospect of like, you know, a future for Syria is dealing with that. And Rama brings the disappeared up. They are the most, you know, some of the most, like, just such a vulnerable population of mothers who just want to know what happened to their sons, and the regime can't even really give them answers or even really try to seek those answers. And so yeah, I mean, it's a big question. I think there's no reconciliation and no justice without finding out the truth and without actually trying to kind of reckon with self-criticism as well of even the uprising or even the regime that we thought kind of represented us wholly and fully. But that requires transparency, and that requires a public knowledge and say in what those procedures would be and what they would look like.
Thank you so much. Joseph, I want to let you answer that question as well, but we're also, this has been such a rich conversation already, and I want to make sure we keep somewhat to time because we're at like an hour and 15 minutes here. So Joseph, I'll direct the next question to you, but you can also get in a point on transitional justice as well, if that's okay. I think we'd be remiss if we close this off without addressing the events of the last week, and especially over the weekend with the expansion of the war against Iran, and how it will affect Syria, and in many ways how it may have been even made possible by Israel's assault on Syria's military. I mean, the first thing I thought when I heard Israel bombing Syria's airports is, well, they can use Syrian airspace now, for attacks against Iran, and surely, they have in the last week or so. I want to ask, just broadly, Joseph, how do you see the events of the last week, affecting what's going on in Syria? And then I'll give each of our respondents a chance to respond to that in turn.
Yeah, thank you, James. Sorry, I'll run to rebound on the issue of transitional justice. I think there was a period in the following weeks after the fall of the regime that the current leading government could have implemented stuff, because we had experiences in other countries as well of transitional justice on the local dynamics. And actually, we didn't witness massacres on a large scale during the weeks after the fall of the regime. And when I speak of sectarianism, just to be clear, sectarianism is a modern political tool to mobilize, to discipline, to divide population. And you don't have to have an Islamic fundamentalist background to do this. We can have secular actors doing this. The Assad regime was a case, even though he wasn't secular, but he was a secular-oriented personality. But if you look at Lebanon, Iraq, and other countries, the Egyptian regime using, so it's a political tool. and we have to look at the production of sectarianism. And today, the main producer of sectarianism in Syria is the current government. Because as I was saying, it was being built, what happened. And there was an opportunity to do transitional justice. But they didn't want to, because as it was said, they have their own crimes. Plus, they included Syrian National Army, well known for its crimes against the Kurds, civilians, and in the coastal area. They filmed themselves and other Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Plus, there's selectivity, which increases, if you want, sectarianism. Why? The latest decree saying that they will implement transitional justice is okay, it's 80% of the crimes, but targeting Assad regime crimes. Nothing on Syrian National Army or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Selectivity also when it comes, because transitional justice, unfortunately for me, is only seen, it's not solely seen crimes against humanity, but there's also economic crimes. And here again, we see various types of behavior according to businessmen. Hamsho, Sami Da'bul, they became okay. So big businessmen that were affiliated with. Others, it's not, even though they tried to reconcile. Even Rami Makhlouf, Samer Fos, and others. So this selectivity also increases, if you want, the sectarianism and political tensions. Plus, throughout the country now, unfortunately, we're seeing, assassinations in the street because one neighbor recognized one of the perpetrator of crimes, and it's not even about sectarian issues. In Aleppo, for example, we have more and more this kind of assassination, people taking their revenge on their own. So this whole process could have been started, I believe, and there's a big responsibility in this perspective. On this, few days after the massacres against the Alawites, the foreign minister, Shibani, said in Brussels that Syria has been ruled for the past 50 years by a minority. And you were kind of legitimating what happened. It was clear that he was pointing out to the Alawites. So when I say it's about really, it's a political tool. We have to see sectarian not as instant hatred, but as a political tool to and transitional justice, unfortunately, is being used in the selectivity and increasing political and sectarian tension in the country. And I think it's doing on purpose. Regarding Iran, I think it's notable to say that Syria has been, I think, the only country in the region that has not condemned, and not, as I was saying, for hostility towards Iran and for its destructive role in Syria, but because it wants to root itself in this kind of new islands, more border control regarding Hezbollah. But I think what Iran could do, even though Syria would not be its first target, even though you've seen, I think it was a few weeks ago, a so-called resistant group with the same logo of Hezbollah trying to launch rockets from southern Syria. It was clearly attempts to create instability in Syria. So Iran could, I think, instrumentalize certain groups, former regime affiliates, but its first target today is not this, it's to survive, basically. And the latest US attacks, I think what is important to note is that this proved that this was a US-led attacks from day one, from 13th of June. And I think we have to be clear, is that Israel is the implementer, but who gave the order is the US. And the nuclear issue is only, I believe, is obviously part of the objective, but the key objective is really to impose hegemony through war, violence, etc. And I think, understandably, orientation of the Syrian government, even though I criticized it, but I think it can weaken its own interest because of the violation on a daily basis of Israeli occupation army in southern Syria. If you don't condemn here, you lose a point to your own territories, I think. Well, this is secondary, but this is where I see the issue for Syria for the moment regarding the expansion of the war. And again, I can understand certain feelings among Syrians, but I think, again, it's to analyze and understand that the current orientation is not reflective only of a popular hostility, but also is a clear policy orientation. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. Rama or Yasmin, did you want to address the war with Iran?
Yeah, what I'll add is I think echo what Joseph was saying in terms of like Iran potentially use this as an opportunity to like, you know, sow more chaos potentially in Syria in response. And also to Joseph's point of just like, you know, I think I've seen Syrians' reactions in this moment, and understandably so. And also just a reminder that's just like, you know, Israel, I think, has killed hundreds of Iranians in the past week or so. That doesn't help anything in Syria. That does not help the Syrian people. That only, further oppresses the people of Iran. And I think I'll end on like a reminder of what our assignment is for those of us who are in the US and or other Western states that continue the flow of arms to Israel, that continue to support the United States. There's no one standing up to the United States, you know. I mean, seems like Europe is on board mostly as well in this moment of time. Our assignment, like we can talk a lot about what folks on the ground in the region aren't doing. Our assignment is clear. Our assignment is the arms embargo on Israel. Our assignment is to stop our own governments in this moment to further escalate against the people of Iran and what will be a disaster against, in the whole entire region. And obviously, the attention that continues to be taken away from Gaza in this moment of time as people get, start worrying. And we should worry about Iran, and also not let this distract from an ongoing genocide that's now 20 months in the way. So what is, urge all of us to think about how are we supporting efforts in this moment to end all of this militarism.
Yeah, I 100% co-sign that. I mean, I've certainly felt in the last week or so that, as much as we do the work that we do in this space and in other spaces to educate people about what's going on in the region, perhaps with some hope that a better educated public is going to stand up to this kind of militarism over time. When it's come to what's happened in Iran, I mean, or regarding Iran, you just have to yell stop. You don't need a graduate degree in Middle East studies to yell stop. To know, you just simply have to have been alive to witness what the United States has done in the Middle East, in Iraq, and other places in the last 20, 25 years. I mean, it's that simple. We are just about at time. I know Yasmin has indicated that she didn't really have much else to add on the Iran point. So I want to thank everyone for coming to this event. I know that there has been a lot of activity in the chat and questions in the chat, and I hope through the course of our discussion that we've been able to answer many of the questions that were submitted in the chat. We're going to collect those and also try to make sure that these topics continue to get addressed in further events in this series. This was such a rich conversation. Thank you, Joseph, Rama, Yasmin. I mean, you guys got the assignment. Talk about assignments. You guys got it, and really, I think fulfilled, all of it and then some. And I'm really just glad to be with you in this moment. So I want to thank also Shireen, my co-conspirator in so much of this, for helping put this together, and Ashley and the other folks from Spectre and Merip who've played a part in this. Stay tuned. We will be announcing another iteration of this conversation, before too long, and you'll be able to see this event and the other events in our series on Merip's YouTube channel, which should be pretty easy to find for all of you.